Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. This is Tony of Comic Conversations, the podcast that reviews more comics than anybody else. You can check out my show at halfguard.com. On this week's graphic novel recap, in honor of Marvel Legacy, I'll be covering Marvels, the 5-part graphic novel series, collecting issues Marvel 0 through 4. Story by Kirk Busiek and art by Alex Ross. Alright, with that out of the way, let's go straight into the book. Issue 0. We open the book with an image of a human torch, and a quote from Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. That is with considerable difficulty that I remember the original era of my being. Phineas Thomas Horton is working on this artificial human. The android sees Horton as a father figure. We see the progress of Horton's work. First a skeleton and later a nervous system. As the android achieves consciousness, something happens. Due to a flaw in his conception, his android body has an incendiary reaction to the oxygen. Horrified with the inflammation, Horton cuts the air. Horton proudly displays his creation to the scientific community and media. Horton was scorned for creating a potential menace. Unwilling to stand up to public pressure, Horton buckles. He places the android in a steel tomb and buries him in a foundation of cement, away from oxygen and crowds. The public was happy to see the android go away, but Horton had other plans for the android. The android was provided a way to be educated while in his foster home of stone, until he could cure or control his affliction. Salvation for the android came in the form of a crack. The crack provided the smallest amount of air. The android again would be engulfed in flames, breaking free from his stone tomb. Horton cried out to his creation, but fearing imprisonment, the android ran. In the days that followed, the android would soon learn to control his condition. End of issue 0. Book 1. It's 1939. We see Phil Sheldon, a news photographer. He with a bunch of young men are talking about Hitler and the pending World War. Sheldon is eager to go to war to take photos. A young James Jonah Jameson tells Sheldon, while Europe may be where everything may be happening, it's also where everyone's dying. He brags about one day running the Bugle. Maybe he'll let Sheldon head the Foreign Bureau, he says. Maybe. Sheldon is taking photos at the Horton display of the synthetic man. He proudly displays what he calls his human torch. Shocked, Sheldon quickly came to his senses. It's probably a fake, he thinks to himself. As Sheldon takes photos of the creature, he can't help but feel like the torch is staring back at him. That's impossible, he thinks to himself. The onlookers tell him that the creation is a danger to the whole city. Destroy it or they'll force him to do it. The story makes front page news. Sheldon feels sorry for Horton having to destroy his creation. We are then introduced to Sheldon's love of his life, Doris Jacquet. Phil's excited by the prospects of going to Europe, covering the war, making a name for himself, and providing Doris with the little house in Queens, the white picket fence. Doris says she'll settle for a safe Sheldon. Phil hears a scream. He goes to investigate. It's the human torch walking in broad daylight. It wouldn't take long for the torch to learn how to fly and leave the people be. People are not sure what exactly they just saw. The human torch they were all so sure wasn't real just walked amongst them and flew away. The next day, as Phil was enjoying lunch, a panicked Doris goes to talk to Phil. She was eating her lunch at the waterfront, as she often does, when she spotted a large naked man. He had a bandaged girl with him. The police said he kidnapped her from the hospital. The police shot him, but the bullets didn't hurt him. He picked up a car and threw it at the officers. Annoyed, he jumped into the ocean and swam away. The officers said they didn't see him once come up for air. It must be the submariner they've been hearing so much about. The diner patrons chalk it up to an Orson Welles trick. Soon after, the human torch was seen flying again through the air, later coming down and melting a car. Soon after, the subway tunnels began to flood. Someone saved the patrons, but some argue who's to say he didn't start the flood in the first place. Soon word of the human torch flying medicine to a trapped town would make its way to New York. Phil starts to second guess his marriage to Doris. How can he bring a family into the world with such monsters? Phil pens the name Marvels to them, as he begins to notice how their presence has reduced the citizens of New York to just spectators for the real players. As Phil talks to his fellow newsmen, something big is going down. The human torch is battling the submariner. It's as though the gods of legend have returned. As the people root for the human torch, policewoman Betty Dean comes to the defense of Namor the submariner. He's only trying to do what he considers justice for his people. As the two battle to a draw on the oceans by the Statue of Liberty, Namor commandeers a television studio for a message to the Human Torch. This is my final warning, get off my trail, Torch, or suffer the consequences. Phil considers himself lucky for not getting to go to Europe right away. He'd be missing out on all the marvels of New York. Betty Dean is able to broker a ceasefire with the Submariner and Torch. As they shake hands, the reporter swears the two are smiling. Phil talks to Doris. He's getting cold feet about the marriage. How is he supposed to raise a family when there's so much danger in the world? Doris walks away from Phil. If he ever comes to his senses, he'll know where to find her. Phil thinks to himself, it can't be like this forever, can it? As the years go by, word of Captain America start to make their way to New York. The public doesn't know what to make of the guy. Does he have superpowers? Why is the army being so secretive about him? He grabbed front page after front page. All the stories about him couldn't be true, could it? It was though he was single-handedly taking the fight to the Nazis. The public loved him. They weren't scared of him. He was as much a marvel as the Human Torch or Submariner, but the public took to him so quickly. Didn't ask any questions. Was it because the others were outsiders and he was one of them? Their own personal American champion? As the newsreels made their way to theaters, who but the Human Torch and Submariner had joined Captain America and his battle against the Nazis? The public began to fall in love with the Marvels. Phil would use this time to reconnect with Doris. She accepted his offer to start all over again. It wouldn't take much for things to start to go south. Namor turned his back on the surface world yet again, and during a raid, the Human Torch had gone missing. Word had got around that Namor had started a one-man war with the surface, and it quickly was making its way to New York. The people can only stand in horror as a giant tidal wave flooded their beloved city. The wave would bring a world of damage, but also the return of the Human Torch. The Torch calls out to Namor saying, "This stops now." Phil was the first and only one at the scene. As the two battled back and forth, a flying brick hit him in the face, knocking him out. Namor would make reparations for his attack. It seemed that Namor was back on the side of the Angels. It was then that the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and nobody cared about the Marvels anymore. The brick would take Phil's eye, forcing him to wear an eye patch for the rest of his life. Wasting no time, Phil would wed Doris. Phil's eye loss would make him ineligible for the draft, but regardless, he was off to Europe to cover the war. And again he would bear witness to the wonders of the Marvels. End of Book 1. Book 2. There was so much energy in New York, as if fireworks had been going on for months. The Fantastic Four, the Avengers, Thor, Giant Man, the Return of Submariner, and last but not least, Captain America himself. We see Phil talking to a publisher about his idea for a book consisting entirely of photos of what he calls Marvels. Sure, the people of New York love them, but would the book sell? Phil brings up, yes, maybe the people of New York won't be impressed because they live side by side with the Marvels, but just imagine what Chicago, San Diego, and people all around the world would think of this book. The book seems like a no-brainer. Phil's on cloud 9, but the feeling would not last when there's a giant commotion on the streets. Is it a monster? A villain? As the people flock to the sea, someone says they tried to kill him. A construction worker. They attacked him just for the thrill of it. Somebody's got to do something about it. They knocked him right off the scaffold. They tried to blast him to bits, claw him, and smash him into the wall. We're going to show them you can't mess with real humans. Phil heard later that they weren't trying to hurt the man but save him after he fell, but that didn't make any sense. They wanted us all dead and everybody knew that. It's the X-Men, superpower mutants, freaks. They look normal but were anything but. The mob hurled insults at the mutants. Phil even threw a brick at the ice one. It nailed him. The one with the laser eye tells him, forget it, they're not worth it. As they flee the scene, the crowd disperse. The words would haunt Phil. They're not worth it. What did he mean? As wonderful as the Marvels were, the mutants were the dark side of the Marvels. Captain America and Mr. Fantastic spoke of the greatness within humanity. The mutants were death. The next step in human evolution? Would they bring an end to humanity? Phil would make his way home. His children were playing Marvels, name-dropping individuals like the sinister Hulk and Submariner, the heroic Spider-Man and Human Torch, but never once did they play mutants. The mutants were worse than any supervillain. The heroes would do away with any villain, but who would deal with the mutants? Protect humanity. Were the mutants the price of the Marvels? The negatives without which the pictures couldn't exist? As Phil ponders this the next day at work, he's assigned to take photos at a sculpture exhibit. The sculptures are various heroes and villains. The Fantastic Four and Tony Stark were in attendance. Amazing to think a blind woman can make all the statues from just physical descriptions. Phil's next assignment would be covering the announcement of Reed Richards and Sue Storm's engagement. Fantastic Four mania was in full effect. Heading back home, there was a mutant scare in the community. The Marvels, much less the mutants, never showed their face in the suburbs. Once home, Phil was greeted by his crying daughters. Don't let them hurt them, Daddy. Hurt her, he says? Doris tells Phil it's about something in the basement. The day before, Phil had caught the girls gathering scraps, he assumed for a stray dog. It was a scared, defenseless little mutant girl. Phil was terrified. Is the mutant contagious? Will his daughters become infected? They found her in the park after the big storm. Wet, cold, and hungry, the daughters felt they had to take her in. Her parents disowned her, abandoned her. Phil is reminded that the mutants were evil, wanted to kill humanity, but then the little one spoke. Are you going to send me away, she says. If the neighbors found out, they'd surely burn down their house with them inside. It didn't matter if they were friends or not, they were scared of mutants. The look in her eyes, though, reminded him of Auschwitz. He couldn't say no, she was just a little girl. Phil did some research on the X-Men. There were some reports of the X-Men freeing a military base for Magneto, protecting defense secrets, even stories of mutants at the engagement party for Reed and Sue. Speaking of Richards, Phil got his next assignment, taking photos for the wedding of the century. The media was all over the event. Print and television stations were covering the entire thing. It was a who's who of the Marvel community. At the reception, a television airs a debate between Oliver Trask and Charles Xavier about the mutant menace. Trask uses the debate to show off his latest creation, the Sentinels, a giant robotic army tasked with hunting mutants and mutant sympathizers. The demonstration would prove to be a failure as the Sentinels refused to take orders from anyone. That's when the riots began. Fear of the mutants had reached its zenith. Out of fear, mobs began to form, damaging public and private property, even the lives of innocent bystanders. Phil was there to document it all. Perfectly rational people weren't thinking anymore. The fear from the mutants had grown too strong for society. It was only fitting that the Sentinels would end it. After all, they were the ones that set it off. The Sentinels lit their floodlights, causing the rioters to come to their senses when finally exposed to their rampage. Phil was reminded of Doris and his daughters. He heads home. Luckily his family is okay, but what he finds weighs heavily on his heart. It's a note from the little girl. She's thankful for all they had provided, but she doesn't want to bring any harm to Phil's family. She was out there, alone. On this night of all nights, Phil thinks to himself. A newscast report on the television reports that the Sentinels had all gone missing, somewhere in the Westchester County area. The X-Men were also seen in the vicinity. Phil's daughter asks if the mutant Maggie is going to be okay. Phil, not knowing how to respond to his daughter, tells her he sure hopes so. End of Book 2. Book 3. The public quickly turned on the Marvels. A passionate romance had turned into a cynical tolerance. Phil was assigned with Ben Urich to a piece called Tony Stark Trying to Buy Respect. Phil lamented how such an article would kill his book. The public doesn't even consider Iron Man a Marvel. He's an athlete, a gun for hire. He wears the suit. It's not like he built it, Urich says. Backing the Avengers, hiring Iron Man. What was Stark up to, Phil thought. The mayor had declared them a public menace and ordered them to disband. Before you knew it, the Avengers had been absolved of all crimes. It was a plot by one of their many enemies. The mayor was quick to retract his statement and declare it Avengers Day, but the damage had already been done. Some thought Tony Stark paid off the police. This would not end the superhero witch hunt. Washington wanted to know who was behind the Iron Man mask. Doris was able to drag Phil long enough away from his work for a family trip to the zoo, but even then the Marvels found their way into that as well. The zoo began to slowly flood. It didn't take long for soothsayers to warn of the apocalypse. The Avenger Hawkeye assured the zoo-going public that it was a byproduct of their battle with the undersea villain Atuma. Unfazed, the preachers continued to preach of doomsday. There is no hope in the super beings. They shall not stand against the apocalypse. Ye it shall be the superheroes who usher in the end. Iron Man and the Avengers weren't the only Marvels getting bad press either. J. Jonah Jameson wages one-man war against the supposed menace Spider-Man. The Fantastic Four's battles with large monsters caused traffic congestions and widespread property damage in Midtown. And lastly, the Hulk was reported to attack the White House. Atomic energy, like the heroes, had been a shining miracle of modern science, but it wouldn't take long before it was feared, a force to bring about the end of the world. The public feared for their lives, calling regulations for the heroes. Soon after, the skies were engulfed in flames. It didn't take long for the media to dismiss the occurrence as an optical illusion. Next, the sky would be filled with boulders. The public was terrified that at any minute they'd all fall, crushing them to death. It seemed the preacher's call for the apocalypse started to add up. The three signs, water, fire, now this, and soon after, Judgment Day. A silver flying surfer would be seen in the air. The Human Torch was the first on the scene. Attempting to take the fight to the Silver Invader, he was quickly dispatched by the Chrome Alien in mere seconds. The stage was now set for the Service Master, a giant purple centurion. He spoke. My journey has ended. This planet shall sustain me until it has been drained of all elemental life. So speaks Galactus. The public's prayers were answered in the form of the Fantastic Four. The space god Galactus made quick work of them. The Fantastic Four had lost. With his great power, Galactus began turning the Fantastic Four's home, the Baxter Building, into one of his personal devices. Horrified, the public howled out for the return of the Fantastic Four. Where are the Avengers? And Spider-Man, they cried. Just as it seemed all hope was lost, the FF got their second wind. The thing started tearing apart Galactus' machine, and Reed took it to Galactus in the form of a bouncing ball. But it barely seemed to faze the space god. Phil began to wonder who would care about a morning edition tomorrow if there's no tomorrow. Predicting an end to the world, Phil made his way home to be with his family. Even the Surfer would join the battle against Galactus, but he too was no match for the space god. The realization that it was the end of the world began to wash over the citizens of New York. A delusional citizen claimed that Captain America would sort this all out. He's seen him fight, he says. They just need to find him. Finally making his way home, Phil embraced his family for what may have been the last time, when the television reported that the creature known as Galactus had disappeared. They aired the last footage of Galactus on Earth. Reed Richards held up a small device, and it seemed to cause the giant creature great concern. After a moment, Richards gave the giant the device. The Earth breathed a collective sigh of relief. The Fantastic Four had saved them all. It didn't take too long after that for the media to again turn their backs on the heroes. Jameson claimed that the entire Galactus affair was a hoax. Outraged, Phil told the mocking public, "You people, what do you need? The world to actually end? Are you so busy digging for garbage you can't admit to yourself that you're grateful? Look up, why don't you? Look for once in your lives." End of Book 3. Book 4. Nobody knew where the Avengers had gone off. Off in another galaxy, fighting two warring alien races, knowing if they failed it would spell the doom for humanity. Unlike the zoo incident, there would be no updates to the general public. All anyone could do was pray and hope everything would turn out okay. They were laying their lives on the line for them, after all they had done to them, subjugating them to Senate investigations, attempting to forcibly arrest them, falling for an evil alien masquerading as a senator. It didn't take much for the public to turn on their champions. The heroine known as the Black Widow was charged with first-degree murder for stopping the criminal Scorpion, even though he wasn't even dead as it turned out. The people of Harlem turned their back on the African-American superhero Falcon. And lastly, Jonah's personal war with Spider-Man, accusing the hero of killing Captain George Stacy. The last straw for Phil was during a vacation. Galactus had returned, but the Fantastic Four again drove him off. Reed Richards spoke to everyone somehow, right into their minds, telling them they were safe again, that everything was all right. Phil's response to the news? Pointing to a newspaper lambasting them. Phil decided his course of action would be clearing the name of Spider-Man. But before he could do that, Robbie of the Bugle sent Phil to investigate the new hero for hire, Luke Cage. In return for covering the story, Robbie would agree to give Phil the file on the George Stacy murder. Luke Cage was uneasy knowing his face would be featured in the story covering his heroics and business. Phil talked to witness after witness about the events that led to Captain Stacy's death. One claiming Spider-Man intentionally threw a chimney at Captain Stacy. Phil then talked to the police. The police told him not to believe everything he reads in the paper. Spider-Man is merely wanted for questioning. If anything, the evidence points to the chimney being toppled by something hard and metallic, but they can't question Spidey so they don't have a case against Dr. Octopus. Witness after witness had confirmed that Spider-Man intentionally killed Captain Stacy. Last but certainly not least, Phil questioned J. Jonah Jameson himself, asking how Spider-Man can be a coward when he does nothing, but a criminal when he springs into action. Then a break in the case. Spider-Man nabbed Doc Ock for the authorities. Phil went to Rikers Island where Octavius was being held pending his trial to question the mad scientist. Asking him, eyewitnesses reported him flailing his tentacles about, as though he had lost control. Octavius responds, "No, Otto never loses control. Spider-Man doesn't have the brain to interfere with the workings of his amazing arms." Phil is quick to respond with, "Who said anything about Spider-Man?" Phil pleads to Dr. Octopus, "You're going to be in jail for a long time. Why not do the honorable thing and let Spider-Man off the hook?" Otto neither confirms or denies anything. Nor should he says. Otto takes pleasure in watching Spider-Man squirm. He wanted Phil to know what he had done. Wanted him to admire the skill which he'd framed Spider-Man, either intentionally or not. Out of options, it's then that he's confronted by George Stacy's daughter Gwen. Gwen didn't believe Spider-Man had killed her father. She didn't blame him, not anymore. George thought Spider-Man was a good man, a hero. It's then that they were erupted what became routine over the years, an underwater army from the Submariner Namor for another injustice he believed the surface world had committed. Gwen took pleasure in the moisture environment the army had created. As she stood there in awe, it became clear to Sheldon why the heroes did what they did. Not for the approval of the masses, but for wonderful people like Gwen. Soon after, Phil again would visit Gwen, because she believed that she was in possession of her father's journal where he documented his approval of Spider-Man. When he witnessed the Green Goblin kidnapping her, Phil made chase via taxi. As the Goblin headed towards the Brooklyn Bridge, Spider-Man appeared. The two battled in the sky. Phil saw everything through his telephoto lens. Phil admits he probably should have called the police, but he had faith that Spider-Man would save her. The Goblin threw Gwen Stacy off the bridge to distract him. In attempting to save her with a web line, the whiplash had snapped her neck. Spider-Man stopped the Goblin. Soon after, the police, reporters, and ambience had all made their way to the scene. The front page read, "Norman Osborn dead. Body found in chemical industry mogul's warehouse under mysterious circumstances. Spider-Man, Green Goblin involved." Her death didn't even make the front page. Stacy's daughter gets buried in paragraph 10. It's then that Phil Sheldon realizes the battles would never end. They would go on, seemingly forever. Phil passes down his camera and his remaining work to his assistant. He's seen too much, and he's inside now where he can't see anything straight anymore. Phil decides to retire and spend his last days with his loving wife. End of Book 4. Thanks again for checking out my video. I hope you had as much fun watching my video as I did making it. Again, don't be a stranger to check out my podcast, Comic Conversations, the podcast that reviews more comics than anybody else at halfguarded.com. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and as always, check you guys out next time. Adios.